Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne. And lately I've been reading W.G. Sebald's nonfiction book on the natural history of destruction.
And I've been rereading Samuel R. Delany's novel, Dhalgren. So, listeners, please get yourself a comfy drink, pull up a seat, and join us for a conversation about these books and more here at the Spouter-Inn. Ho-dee-oh-ho, 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 ho. We are talking about some people that we've talked about before. We're revisiting some authors.
Yeah, even though the book I'm going to be talking about a little later, Sebald's On the Natural History of Destruction, that book is new to me, but we had read his Rings of Saturn in the past together, which was really awesome.
And that was a fiction book, and now you're going to talk about a nonfiction book. And we talked about Samuel Delany's nonfiction book, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, and now we're going to talk about his fiction book, Dhalgren. I mean, he's got many fiction books, but, and many nonfiction books. Whatever. You know what I mean? We're doing a little switcheroo. It's going to be fun.
And I have to say, those two books were two of my, favorite, I have to say, kinds of books of the ones they're all great, right? But those are ones that I think about in a really pleasurable way. Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, and Rings of Saturn. Those are books that both really kind of pushed my idiosyncratic buttons of the kinds of books I love to read.
And you were telling me right before we started that when you picked up a copy of the Sebald book, this nonfiction book, that it came with a little bit extra.
Yeah, I had the strangest experience. I ran across a reference to this book, which I'd heard of before, but I ran across a reference to it. I thought, I really do want to read that. So I ordered a copy, and I ordered a used copy because it was a little bit cheaper. And when it arrived, it came with, I guess you could say, bonus features. It had the name of the person who owned it in the inside front cover, Noel. And it had a letter that had been written to Dr. and Mrs. Robert Noel back in February 2004, sent to him by a Mr. Norman Zunberg from Oregon. And also it had a separate piece of paper, which also had been typed by this Robert Noel, which was something he wanted to remember. It's an excerpt from another work by Sebald's, The Immigrants, a paragraph that he obviously thought was really important as a kind of context for this book. He had two different quotations typed out from it. And also lots of pencil annotations. And it was just the strangest experience before I even started reading the book, to read these responses and exchanges, because Noel had obviously read this book. It had a big impression on him, and he told his friend about it. And because the friend writes to him, he talks about this book you recommended to me, and he kind of responds to it kind of point by point. And in the margin, he writes sort of in handwriting all the way up, "Thanks a lot for the book suggestion. It provoked much thought. How about your reactions?" So it's so neat to be an eavesdropper on these guys.
Yeah. That's wonderful. That's one of the best things you can discover usually when you get a used book, if you're doing it old school and buying it in a bookstore, you might find the little slip of paper with something in it. But that's phenomenal just to get it through an online purchase, and also for it to be so engaged with the book, and from what sounds like are some very interesting perspectives on it.
Yeah, and also this feeling of being an eavesdropper. Robert Noel was a professor of English. I looked him up, right, at the University of Nebraska. Zunberg was a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Oregon. They'd both been in the Army, one in Japan, one in Germany, and they both passed. Noel died in 2009, Zunberg died in 2014. So it's listening to a conversation, but they're ghosts, right?
Yeah.
So it was kind of I don't know, it felt really resonant with our conversations in a strange kind of way, because they clearly were reading together as well.
Wow. Well, my copy of Dhalgren, I did pick up. I've picked up many used copies of Dhalgren over the years. It's one of those ones that you keep buying and then lending to people and buying new ones, or at least I have. Mm-hmm. But one of Delany's other novels, The Einstein Intersection, I read it many years ago when I was house sitting for a friend who's also a book dealer out in Oregon, out in Portland. And, I got to spend several weeks looking at all his cool books. And this one I pulled out, and I was excited to read it. And then I noticed that it was inscribed. And on the inside, it said, "Good wishes and better to Roger Zelazny."
Oh, wow.
Who's another prominent science fiction writer, a peer of Delany's, from the guy who shares all those letters in his name with you, Chip Delany, London, 73.
Oh, cool. That's very cool.
It is so great. It was so fun. And but also like I'm now reading. I'm using it as a reading copy. This like, I don't know, this artifact, this object. The asking price in the book was $15. I guess it wasn't that fancy, but still, I felt like I had to be extra careful reading it. And I also felt like there was some deep connection. But there were no marginal notes from Zelazny that I remember. So I assume he read it. It's a short book and it's pretty good, but who knows? Who knows?
Well, it's really neat, right? Because it's a reminder of what real, tangible books are for. We both read online quite a bit as well, right? But there are times when you read with a book in your hand, and that is different. And I think having the opportunity or being obliged, depending on how you look at it, to read online so much provides this opportunity to kind of think about what are material books for? Like, what is it about them? And one of them is this being connected to the other readers in a different kind of way.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of like autographed books per se. I know there's some connection to the sort of the author, the actual, like they actually pressed their hand or the pen onto this and whatnot. It can be fine. I'm not like mad at people who are into that, but it has never done much for me. But a nice long inscription or something that like provides a lot of either specific context to the authors or to the readers, or just like that nice, like, happy graduation, hope you like this book, and it's a copy of The Bell Jar. Like, you think, okay, this is a weird choice. Yeah. But like that makes it, that just, I don't know, it makes the book more specific in a fascinating way.
Mm-hmm. It's about the intimacy of reading, I think.
Yeah.
The fire, now rising 2,000 meters into the sky, snatched oxygen to itself so violently that the air currents reached hurricane force, resonating like mighty organs with all their stops pulled out at once. The fire burned like this for 3 hours. At its height, the storm lifted gables and roofs from buildings, flung rafters and entire advertising billboards through the air, tore trees from the ground, and drove human beings before it like living torches. Behind collapsing facades, the flames shot up as high as houses, rolled like a tidal wave through the streets at a speed of over 150 kilometers an hour, spun across open squares in strange rhythms like rolling cylinders of fire. The water in some of the canals was ablaze. The glass in the tramcar windows melted. Stocks of sugar boiled in the bakery cellars. So, as I mentioned earlier, we had read Sebald's Rings of Saturn back in April 2022. And it was a really beautiful book and a very elegiac book that was about memory, about the self, about landscape. And this book is also about all those things, memory, the self, and the landscape. But instead of the sort of bucolic and melancholy landscapes of England, like in the Rings of Saturn, this is about a landscape that Sebald knew and didn't know, and could talk about and couldn't talk about. The landscape of Germany under the experience of air war in the 1940s. So it's a very strange kind of book. So Winifred Georg Sebald was born very near the end of the war, born in 1944 and died in 2001. And he was a German writer and academic, born in Bavaria, educated in Germany and in Switzerland. But much of his adult life was lived in England, where he was on the faculty of the University of Manchester and then later the University of East Anglia. And he died at a relatively young age, 57. And he's probably most famous for his last novel, Austerlitz. But as I said before, The Rings of Saturn is fabulous. I absolutely love it. He also wrote a novel, which I mentioned very briefly before, The Immigrants, because the person who'd read this copy of Sebald that I have had clearly also been very much taken by that novel. During the war, as I mentioned, Sebald was born near the end. His father was a soldier in the army and was a prisoner of war until 1947. And Sebald seems to have been quite distant from his father, like he kind of alludes to this obliquely in his own writing. But if his father wasn't very present in his mind or in his writing, the war is certainly incredibly present. The war and the Holocaust, right, which are interwoven but are two different experiences of suffering. And you see at least maybe in The Rings of Saturn, but in this book, it's the central preoccupation. What he's writing about is, and he's very explicit about this, why were German writers incapable of writing about the effects of the air war on the people of Germany? And this book, called On the Natural History of Destruction, the German title, the original German title was a little different. It was Luftkrieg und Literatur, so air, war, and literature. And it's neat to think about why natural history, like what kind of work that change in title might be doing. So the German version came out in 1999. This translation came out a few years later in 2003 after Sebald's death. So he was not totally involved in the production of the English language version. And you can kind of see it because the English language version is a little bit different in that it has some extra essays attached to it that are on German writers of the mid-20th century. So the book doesn't really hang together as a coherent whole, at least I don't think so. The opening part, the first 100 pages, one long chapter in sections, is this incredibly powerful account of air war in literature, which is an adaptation and update on a series of lectures that he gave in 1997. And then when they published it in German, there was one chapter added, which sort of works, right? But then those extra ones are like kind of inside baseball. Like if you're really interested in mid-20th century German literature, great. But if you're not that interested in it, they're not so much. But this opening section is like, I don't know, I found it really mind-blowing for a lot of different reasons. Sorry, that was like a lot of talking, but like it's quite a difficult book in some ways. Like it's a subject I have read about a fair amount and know a little bit about personally, because my mother was born in Germany in 1946, and her family had also lived through the hard times right after the war, and also this crisis of unspeakability. So, when I read this book, I feel like it's very familiar in some ways, but it's also very difficult to grapple with.
Yeah. So it seems like, even from the title, or the German title at least, that it's taking on the sort of these two sides. One is the air war, the Luftkrieg, and the other is the reaction or lack of reaction from literature. And based on the excerpt that you read to begin with, it sounds like he's trying to start supplying some description and reaction to that air war, in addition to talking about the reasons why there might not have been much of a discussion about it in German literature after the war. Yeah,
he does actually a few really interesting things. One is to, like you said, kind of acknowledge and point out the ways in which writing about the air war is like, that there's a kind of a gap, even in the literature that was written in the wake of the war. I forget what they call it in English, like Trümmerliteratur. It's like literature of the ruins, kind of. Even there, it's like very inadequately written about for the most part. And so he goes back in this kind of almost archaeological retrieval to look for accounts that were written either like during the time of the war, like diary entries and other kinds of like reporting almost. And he has a few accounts that are written much later, but also have that like intensely kind of diary-like quality. So he's looking how to fill in those gaps, but he's doing yet a third thing as well, which is to kind of give account of his own inability to give voice to all of that. I mean, even though he was born near the end of the war, or only a year before the end of the war, he sees it as a kind of a blind spot in his own experience. And he writes about this really interestingly, actually, in the preface, when he's talking about the inability of German people to talk about that experience of the air war in particular. He says this. He says, the idea behind the first lecture came from Carl Selig's account of an excursion he made in the summer of 1943 with Robert Walser, then a patient in a mental hospital, on the very day before the night when the city of Hamburg went up in flames. Selig's reminiscences, which make no reference at all to this coincidence, gave me a clearer view of the perspective from which I myself look back on the terrible events of those years. So it's this weirdly complicated kind of positioning, right, where he's looking back at people's accounts of that time and how they're sort of both looking at and not looking at this particular set of horrors, and trying to reckon with it in a very personal way, like a very autobiographical way, and also in this sort of synoptic global way. And he puts it in this really interesting way. He says, when he's talking about German people, he says, when we turn to take a retrospective view, especially of the years 1930 to 1950, we're always looking and looking away at the same time, which I think is such an interesting phrase.
It is a lovely phrase. And I think this is a topic which sounds, for me as an outsider who is not German and didn't live through the bombing, of course, sounds very interesting and also sounds very difficult to read. Like this is the prospect of reading this. It's a hard read. It's a hard read. It sounds like.
Yeah. And how can I put it? Easier and also harder because Sebald is such a beautiful writer. Like you'll notice even in that little passage I read, I was really it's part of a long passage that is like a diary entry or an account that was written at the time of Hamburg in 1943 at the time of the firestorms. And so I left out, like I'm reading the least bad parts.
Thank you.
They're incredible. No, I mean, like, of course, right? And even those are really awful and painful. But Sebald is such a beautiful writer that it, in a way, makes it easier and harder to read. Easier in the sense that you're like, even while you're horrified, you're like, wow, that's like, in that closing part of that paragraph, the water in some of the canals was ablaze. The glass in the tram car windows melted. Stocks of sugar boiled in the bakery cellars. Like, these are all glassy things, right? The water, the glass, the boiling sugar. So it's kind of beautiful and transparent and like it's almost like illuminating, and it's absolutely dreadful, And then and as it goes on, it's increasingly dreadful. So the beauty of his writing does this strange thing where it makes it palatable. It's almost like eating sweet poison, you know what I mean? Like, and so you eat it and you're more and more sickened by it in a sense. And so it's a very strange experience.
Is he self-conscious about that? Like, does he bring up the fact that he's polishing or putting not a sheen, but like writing beautifully about terrible things?
He doesn't reflect on that explicitly, but he does another, again, kind of beautiful thing in the book that will be familiar from his Rings of Saturn. He includes quite a lot of photographs. And the kinds of photographs he chooses are really interesting. Like, they're not scenes of horrible destruction. They're scenes that somehow give you a kind of another layer, another dimension of what it is he's describing in the text. So there's one point, for example, when he's talking about footwear. He's talking about how, particularly children, but other people too, like, they don't have shoes and their shoes are broken and they're patched together or like tied together or whatever. And then he includes a photograph of, you just see the legs from the knees down, but it's a child wearing shoes that are falling apart. And it's not horrible. It's actually quite aesthetically, it's a very nice picture. So it does this strange kind of effect. And then there's another moment when he's talking about a city that was bombed in the very last days of the war in 1945, devastated. And he shows us a movie poster, which is a movie that was playing at the time of the beginning of the air raids. You know what I mean? And so they're beautiful in something, or, they're candy for the eye, right? In something like the way these poetic prose passages are. But it's not ornamental exactly. I don't know what it is it's doing, but it has this strange effect on you as a reader. Was
there something in particular that drew you to this book right now?
Well, one of the points that Sebald makes, and so this sounds like I'm not answering your question, but in a roundabout way, it absolutely is. One of the things he talks about, especially near the end of that 100-page opening chapter, right, is how the devastations of the air war in Germany are far from unique. Like, he's explicit in saying that, if the Germans had gotten it together to do that to London, they absolutely would have. And he, talks about that at some length. And he also describes how bomb warfare is something that, took place in other places in the early part of the 20th century. And in the very last lines of this long chapter, he says, when we think of the nights when the fires raged in Cologne and Hamburg and Dresden, we ought also to remember that as early as August 1942, when the vanguard of the Sixth Army had reached the Volga, and not a few were dreaming of settling down after the war on an estate in the cherry orchards beside the quiet Don, the city of Stalingrad, then swollen, like Dresden later, by an influx of refugees, was under assault from 1,200 bombers, and that during this raid alone, which caused elation among the German troops stationed on the opposite bank, 40,000 people lost their lives. So he takes pains to kind of push you away from any thought you might have that this was a uniquely horrible experience of being bombed into devastation.
Right. This isn't a thing that just happened to Germany once.
No, right. It happened there, but of course it happened in other places too. And of course, when you look at the pictures of Gaza, like, it's hard not to see these landscapes as all one landscape, right? And so each one of these is not singular, right? And there are all these different iterations, but they're all equally awful. So I suspect that's why it was in my head, just this. And the other reason it was kind of in my head, funnily enough, was because partly because I'd been in Hamburg, like I mentioned before. I was in Hamburg for a few months in the spring of 2024, and it was a lovely city. I had a really good time there. I was doing a research project and getting to know the city by foot and getting to know people there. Very friendly, very congenial city, very different from like Berlin, where I've also spent a fair amount of time. But I knew about the bombing raids because a friend of my grandmother's, who had been a young woman at the time, she and her oldest daughter had been in Hamburg at the time of the firestorm. And I always knew this growing up, that they'd been there at the time of the firestorm, and it was something they never talked about. But neither one of them, neither the mother or the daughter, would ever go into New York City because they're terrified of being around tall buildings. Mm. And so I kind of like always knew this. And so being in Hamburg and seeing all the absence, because everything had to be built again, right?
Right.
And so that had stuck in my head. And so I think recently, just like things like, seeing what devastating landscapes look like on the news. And then, I continue to be in contact with that part of the family, right? So they'd been in my mind. And so I was like, yeah, I read across a reference again to Zabel's book. And I was like, oh, I should read that and see what he has to say about the air war.
Wow. So the air war, specifically the air war part of it, is that mostly because of the sort of amount of destruction that can happen through air bombings? Is it the impersonal nature of it, where the attackers are not on the ground, so to speak? Is there something else about it? Is it the civilians that it seems to target more than anything?
I'm really glad you asked that, because I've been thinking about that a lot over the last couple of weeks, while I was reading the book and then just reflecting on it afterward. I think it's because, like you said, there's that kind of anonymity. It just rains down on you, right? It's this the code name for the bombing operation on Hamburg was Gomorrah, Operation Gomorrah, right? So you could think about, even just like in the planning of the bombing raids, this awareness that it was going to be a rain of fire that was going to destroy the city, right? And thinking about the anonymity of that, on the one hand, makes you see the people on the ground as victims, right? I mean, they're undergoing a rain of fire, right? A storm of fire, right? This catastrophe, right? But, and Zabald takes a lot of pains to emphasize this, there's this awareness that there's guilt, right? In other words, that there's this sense of deserving what took place.
That the Germans started this, that sort of thing?
Exactly. So the air war is devastating in terms of this being this thing this catastrophe that happens to you. But for the German people, the unspeakability comes from this awareness of responsibility and kind of collective guilt, right? That it's required or appropriate in some way. But at the same time, it's this devastating experience, which is almost impossible to put into words because of the nature of that trauma. And he gets at it in this really interesting way of kind of almost talking around it. Like the opening pages give you a lot of numbers. He opens up talking about that there were 131 towns and cities that were affected, 600,000 civilians, 3.5 million homes were destroyed. At the end of the war, there were about 3.5 million people homeless. And then the one part of it that really stands out for me is, he says there are 31.1 cubic meters of rubble for every person in Cologne and 42.8 cubic meters for every inhabitant of Dresden. As if by putting it in numbers, that somehow makes it intelligible, which of course it totally doesn't, because there's numbers.
Yeah, it's an impossible scale to hold on to, really.
Yeah, and this looking at and looking away keeps showing up in all these different kinds of respects. For example, he talks about writers trying to give voice to what happened and using all these kind of cliches, like, how the beautiful city was destroyed or we lost our beautiful city. And he's like, these are all just ways of not actually describing what took place. And there's this one passage that he's giving an account of a reporter who was in Germany in 1946. And he describes this experience of being on the train with locals, right? And Zabald says this. He says, the quasi-natural reflex engendered by feelings of shame and a wish to defy the victors was to keep quiet and look the other way. Stig Dagerman, reporting from Germany in the autumn of 1946, writes from Hamburg that on a train going normal speed, it took him a quarter of an hour to travel through the lunar landscape between Hasselbruck and Landwehr. And in all that vast wilderness, perhaps the most horrifying expanse of ruins in the whole of Europe, he did not see a single living soul. The train, writes Dagerman, was crammed full, like all trains in Germany, but no one looked out the window, and he was identified as a foreigner himself because he looked out. So there's this kind of, like, again, that looking, not looking, right? And it doesn't just come from the horror and the trauma, though that is part of it. And this is what Sebald is excavating, but it also comes from this awareness. And, I was mentioning before the readers, like the guys who were reading this book, these two friends, right? Zundberg and Knoll. And that's the thing they're kind of fixed on, is this speakability, unspeakability thing. And so here, for example, I'm going to read a little bit of the letter. So this is a letter from Norman Zundberg, clinical psychologist, to his friend Robert Knoll about the book. And part of it is all just like really, it's like Dear Virginia and Robert, and then he signs it from himself and his wife too. So they're clearly like couple friends, right? And then he, after the initial sort of nice, friendly stuff, he says, I've just finished reading the book you recommended, Robert, W.G. Sebald's On the Natural History of Destruction. Let me make a few points. And then he gives like point A, point B, point C. But point D is a really interesting one. He says this. He says, you, Robert, mentioned that my experience in Germany may make me more appreciative of what Sebald covers. That is true. Many German terms were familiar, and I also remember the sites of ruined cities such as Frankfurt. He says, I spent a year in Germany in the military in 1946. I have slides showing people digging in rubble, and I heard decomposed bodies were found. One rather dramatic slide is through an upper story of a building, looking through an open wall across the street to hanging remains of other rooms. And I thought that was such an interesting passage because, Robert is like saying, because you were there, maybe this resonates for you, eager to hear what you think about it. And he says, yeah, I remember seeing it, right? I have slides, right? So I have this kind of photographic record, and I heard bodies were found, right? So it's like all very mediated in this strange way. And then the slide he describes as being rather dramatic is where it's a building looking through an open wall to hanging remains of other rooms. And that's very haunting, right? That's such an interesting image. And he doesn't say anything more about it after that. He has a point in E that comes after that is like how much he appreciated reading the book. It's a challenge to our sense of humanity. The ease with which a leader can arouse people to attack, modern weapon. It all gets very like general. But that little paragraph, point D, where he's talking about that dramatic slide is really haunting, I think.
Well, it sounds like he's describing some of the things that he experienced, but he's not reflecting on them or processing them.
He can't really address them. So even he, like, who's there as an observer, and it's a year after the end of the war, even he is kind of not quite able to articulate it, right?
But also it's in response to a book that is thinking about how articulatable or not these experiences are. And I don't know, it's interesting. It's interesting to be moved to go that far, but no further. Not that I can demand anything more from him necessarily. I don't know, but it's interesting in this context.
It also makes me wonder, too, about Knoll. He's a professor of literature, right? So mainly English, but he's also clearly very interested in German literature because his pencil annotations are all over this book. But he was in Japan from 43 to 46. So devastation from the air is something he's going to know about, too, right? And so he's working through this, clearly. And so, as a reader reading it, like each one of us bringing personal relationships to this, what's being described here, but in very different kinds of ways. I just found that really striking and such an uncanny experience of reading.
Yeah. I can't help but think in terms of, books that I've read, I guess, obviously. And Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut is the big one that comes to mind because it's one of the first real literary engagements with the air raids in American literature anyways. And Vonnegut, of course, had been captured in the Battle of the Bulge and was brought to Dresden, and he was there in a sort of prisoner of war camp during the bombing of Dresden. Mm-hmm. And it took him a long time to figure out a way that he could write about it. He talks about how it spent years and he would try drafting stuff and it just didn't feel right. And the approach that he ended up with as he wrote the novel was very sideways, let's just say. It is a very odd book for how you can get at the core thing that you want to talk about, including all sorts of time travel shenanigans and aliens and this, that, and the other, and comedy scenes. But nevertheless, there's this core of the devastation of Dresden in particular, and also Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well, and the other bombings that happened, and how devastating and awful these were, right? Like that's infused throughout it, how inhumane it is to do this to other people. And obviously, Vonnegut isn't coming from the same space as the German residents in terms of the psychological things, but he saw it, and
he hid underground, right? He was a prisoner of war, right?
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, in the introduction to it, when he's sort of talking about making the book, I think it was he, many years later, he met another veteran who had been there, and there was this sort of like a first moment of permission for thinking about it or talking about it, because it was just too much to say. And I can only imagine that for, the people who had sort of, as you were saying, grew up there, like lived there and had a deeper sense of guilt about why this was happening to them.
Even more unspeakable, right?
It could be even more unspeakable, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And this unspeakability shows up. Yeah, I completely agree with you. And this unspeakability shows up throughout the book as a whole in this really haunting way. I had to be really careful, like I said, in sort of choosing what passages to read, because there are passages in here that are really powerful, really evocative, but they're just too awful. I can't read them. And it's like almost obscene. Like I that's the word I kept thinking of. Like it's like obscenity or pornography or something like that. You're like, what is it? When something is so awful, you can't really tell it. And I kept thinking about this as I was reading, and then I found at a later point, actually quite near the end of this 100-page opening chapter, Sebald writes about this himself directly. He says this. He says, "To this day, any concern with the real scenes of horror during the catastrophe still has an aura of the forbidden about it, even of voyeurism, something that these notes of mine have not entirely been able to avoid. I was not surprised when a teacher in Detmold told me a little while ago that as a boy in the immediate post-war years, he quite often saw photographs of the corpses lying in the streets after the firestorm, brought out from under the counter of a Hamburg second-hand bookshop to be fingered and examined in a way usually reserved for pornography." Right? And it's like, I don't know what you do with it. I honestly don't know what you do with it.
Also wonder if writing about myself in the third person is really the way to go about losing or making a name. My life here more and more resembles a book whose opening chapters, whose title even, suggest mysteries to be resolved only at closing. But, as one reads along, one becomes more and more suspicious that the author has lost the thread of his argument, that the questions will never be resolved, or, more upsetting, that the position of the characters will have so changed by the book's end that the answers to the initial questions will have become trivial. It is Troy, Sodom, Çatalhöyük, the city of dreadful. I don't know how to talk about Dhalgren, but let's give it a go. So, we've talked about Samuel Delany before. We've talked about his nonfiction book, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. Just as a reminder, Samuel Delany was born in 1942 in Harlem, in New York. He wrote his first science fiction novel, The Jewels of Aptor, when he was 19. And by the end of the 60s, he'd published several novels and short stories, won some awards, was generally considered one of the more remarkable young talents in science fiction. But then he took a break. Well, he didn't take a break, but he took about 4 years to write his next book, a big book, an absolute brick of a book. Dhalgren, almost 900 pages in its mass market paperback edition, and certainly over 800 in the trade paperback edition that I've got here. It is, in many ways, a challenging novel to read, at least in terms of the other science fiction books published in 1975, but really in terms of literary fiction and any other standard fiction that you might pick up. There's not really a plot in the traditional sense. The language can be very dense and can often be fragmented. That excerpt that I just read ends in the middle of the sentence where I ended reading it. There are explicit sex scenes that are not the kind that are usually offered to a mass market who are interested in explicit sex scenes. And yet, the book quickly sold like hotcakes and has sold more than 1 million copies.
What do you make of that? Like, what is it that excites people? Like, it's a big book. It sounds like pretty epic. What is it that excites people about it?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that Delaney has returned to over the years. And one of the things that I think people liked about it was that he was writing about the kinds of people who don't usually get written about and the kinds of spaces that don't usually get written about. And a lot of people identified with that in some way. They saw a kind of representation in that appealed to them. And, I get that. It's there are some delightful characters and there's some delightful conversations and moments throughout. And, so what if there's not like an overarching plot per se? You just get to spend a lot of time with people in these interesting and intense situations, and they get to sparkle and have conversations or think about things or, just talk for long paragraphs about art theory and poetry and other stuff or the details of their sex lives or whatever. It is kind of interesting that way.
It sounds like the world building is really evocative from what I only read an excerpt of it. I haven't read the whole thing. And it's interesting because if I'm not mistaken, a lot of science fiction writers, when they do this amazing world building, will kind of like divide it up. Like it might be a series, it might be 2 or 3 volumes. Here, the choice is clearly to go for like this one really substantial thing, right? This like epic thing. Does it have like a form to it? Is it more like, a bath you sink into?
It has a form to it, and it is more like a bath you sink into at the same time, in that it's split up into 7 chapters, and the chapters have different focuses and sometimes different approaches to how they're writing. For example, the very final chapter is very remarkably written. So I guess I should explain what the basic plot, so to speak, is about. Our protagonist is a guy who has forgotten his name. He travels to a city called Bologna, a Midwestern American city which has been cut off from the rest of the country and the rest of the world after some kind of unspecified disaster. It's gone from a population of about 2 million down to maybe 1,000 people. Things in the distance are often on fire. There's fog in the air. You barely ever can see the sky, and radios don't work. Limited communication with the outside world. He gets there, he meets some people, he has some sex, he ends up as part of like a throuple, let's say. He has a relationship with a woman named Lanya and a guy named Denny. He writes some poems, and a book called Brass Orchids gets published of his poems. He ends up leading a gang of people called Scorpions, and that's the book. And eventually, at the very end of the book, he attempts to leave and passes somebody else who's entering the town. And so there's a kind of circularity to the whole thing. He's writing these poems in a notebook that he finds early on, which already has writing in it when he finds it. So he's writing them in sort of the margins and writing a few other words and observations, but primarily writing these poems. He's never written poems before, but he's now shown up and he's given this notebook and he starts writing. The final chapter of the book has all these long marginalias. It's almost a representation of the notebook itself. And it actually begins for the first few pages as a transcript of the notebook with like full critical apparatus, like lines crossed out where lines would have been crossed out in the notebook, misspellings left in or annotated, all sorts of details, and descriptions occasionally of when, 3 staples on the bottom of the above page hold a creased rectangle of newsprint and a copy of part of an article from the newspaper that is somehow being published in this town. So like just the look of the page, it's quite striking when you've got, multiple columns of text going throughout it. And it's just very, it's very different.
And the notebook he has is both the notebook he writes in, but it also has writing in it, right? Like it's not just his writing in the notebook, right?
Right. And there is some confusion from other people who look at the notebook, not being able to tell which is his. A poet who has ended up in Bologna, who has he's been published in the New Yorker. He's got some cred. He's got a few chapbooks out. He's very professional in that way. And it's like, oh, I saw the notebook. Like, you said that you found words in the notebook. Like, you probably didn't write any of these, did you? You'd never written before. There's no way. You're not a real poet. This is kind of the dramatic climax of the novel in many ways, is that scene. It's very odd, at least for those of us who are reading it for the poetry thread that's going throughout it. So there's even a question about whether he wrote the text that was in the book when he found it, because there is a kind of circularity to the whole novel, or whether because he doesn't really, think of himself as a writer, even though he has scenes of writing, nevertheless, is he just an amanuensis for some other force? Or like, what is going on? How is this coming to be? There's a very unsure sense of what's going on with the notebook and with his writing that also kind of bleeds throughout the entire novel and all of the writing and all of the text within it. It's not a very stable novel in that sense.
Yeah, the book within a book thing is like really fascinating.
Yeah. And along the way, he meets many people. He meets that poet. He meets another poet who's much kinder to him. And they have lots of discussions about like, what is creativity? What is poetry? What is going on? And many of those are completely delightful. But the kid, as he gets dubbed once he comes into town, or kid with two Ds. All of these come up. None of them are stable. None of them are settled. Not only can he not remember his name, though he remembers other things about his past. He remembers his parents. He remembers places he's been in the world. He starts losing time. He starts not remembering things that happen between scenes. So he'll meet up with the woman he's in a relationship with, and she'll be like, "Where have you been for the last 5 days?" And he's like, "No, I just saw you just now." And it's like, "No, it's been 5 days." And this is causing a lot of crisis for him. But as readers, we also haven't experienced those 5 days, right? We just had a chapter break.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like he's a character in a novel. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yes.
In the same way, if you're trying to write a story and you have a continuity error, like he has continuity errors, right?
Exactly.
It's crazy.
There is a scene where he is going with the Scorpions, going with this gang, on a raid to a department store. And in the middle of the raid, they encounter a mirror. He gets a glimpse of himself in the mirror. But it isn't himself who he sees. It's Samuel Delaney.
Oh, weird.
Yeah, there's all sorts of instability in the text and in what's going on. And all sorts of interesting formal play where phrases will come up again and again. They'll be seen, for example, in the Notebook chapter, but they'll also have come up earlier, either through glimpses of the Notebook or through just things that people have said. So you find all these little like clues weaving throughout the book. And there's a sense that like, well, maybe if I was going to like, get the big board and pin all the things up and put the red string around them, that there'd be something to figure out. And both in the text and in essays that Delaney wrote shortly after the publication of the text, he alluded to some of the trails you could go down about how these things might be connected, that the pages might be out of order, or obviously are out of order in the final chapter, sort of from a chronological and textual perspective, and that if you put them in the right order, it might suggest a different set of things happening than what the book naturally, so to speak, or naively would lead you to believe. It's playing all these little games with you to make you step back, and it puts you in a weird headspace. Let's put it that way, in a very interesting literary way, formally.
Hearing you talk about it reminds me a little bit of the ways in which you were talking about Ulysses, when we were reading Joyce's Ulysses, and even more maybe Finnegan's Wake. Like this, that there's like this underlying, I don't know, puzzlescape, kind of like landscape, but puzzlescape. And you can kind of work some of it out, but a lot of times you try to work it out and it doesn't really get you where you think you're going to go.
Yeah. And I think he's aware of that, both in terms of like things that he's borrowing from Joyce or similar writers, and also things that he's bringing in, but then sort of putting aside. So, for example, one of the things that gets a bit borrowed from Joyce is that the novel begins with a lowercase letter in the middle of a sentence. The first sentence is, to wound the autumnal city. And then if you go to the end of the book, because you've read or at least heard of Finnegan's Wake and you have a suspicion about how these things work, the final sentence is, waiting here, away from the terrifying weaponry, out of the halls of vapor and light, beyond Holland and into the hills, I have come to. And it's like, oh, okay, it is wrapping around. And then you think, wait a minute. No, wait, there's an extra two there. I have come to wound the autumnal city. That's what it should be. So there's a little stutter, which makes perfect sense. And then you think, wait, no, it is fine the way it is. I have come to wound the autumnal city. I've woken up. I've come into consciousness to do this. And that fits so much of what's going on in the book about this like struggle to come into being. And also like the fictionality of like the character coming into being. They're like, no, it's fine. It's playing so many little games like that to unsettle and reorient you.
Yeah, I could totally see that little language game being appealing for him, right? Like to come to a place, but also to come to consciousness. And even like, I don't know, only other thing of his I read is Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, but like the sexual pun, like I wouldn't be surprised that's part of right? The framework.
That probably also is, yes.
No, he's very cool.
So that's sort of the thing that he's borrowing from Finnegan's Wake. But then with something like Ulysses, which of course draws so much on myth and obviously the Odyssey. And Finnegan's Wake also draws on these big myths, as we talked about a little while ago. Early in the book, he encounters a woman on his way into Bologna. He has sex with her. He then goes into a cave and finds some interesting jewelry there, comes out, and then she transforms into a tree. A tree? Cool. Yes. That might have been in the segment that you read. It's in that part. Were the blotches under her breasts scabs? He says, look, I got it. Now, can't you tell me my... Leaves were clutched in her raised hands. Her hands were raised so high, leaves dropped about her shoulders. Her long, long fingers shook with a brittle darkness covered in one flank. Her pale belly jerked with a breath. No! She bent away when he tried to touch her and stayed bent. One-armed, branched, and branching 10 feet over him, pulled a web of shadow across the grass. You was the word he tried. Breath was all that came. He looked up among the twigs of her ears, etc., etc. Like she is fully turned into a tree. And then he runs away. And it's like, we've got this myth of Daphne turning into a tree, but we're running away from that. Like that's the thing that you see at the very beginning of the book, but that's not what we're doing. We're not engaging directly in a systematic way with these myths. That's being set up, and then we're heading out of here to see something else. So he is both playing with, but also denying some of these traditions that he, might have learned from Joyce. I know this is a little out of place because I would normally have asked this early on, but like, when did you first read this book? Like, is this a book you read a long time ago and then you've come back to now, or is it something that's from more recently? I read it a long time ago, probably when I was 20-ish. A friend of mine gave me a copy and encouraged me to read it. I had not read any other Delany at that point. I attempted to read it. I got about 50 pages in, and it just wasn't working for me. I wasn't making heads or tails of it. I put it down, and then, as I talked about last time we talked about Delany, I met him in a curious situation in a class, basically. And after that, I felt really bad for not having read the book. And I went back to it, and then I read it and just loved it and found it bizarre and delightful and interesting, just really gripping, even though I felt like it was a big book that I couldn't wrap my head around. And then I came back to it. I read it again for a few times. I bought copies and gave them to people. And it was one of those books where like, it's a book that you think, I should read this every 10 years. I should come back into Bologna and re-experience it. And then I went to grad school and didn't. And so it's been sort of on my to-read pile to get back to for 20 years now, at least. And it was lovely. Our friend Jared from By the Bywater, the Tolkien podcast here on Megaphonic, who's been on the show, just made a joke about wounding the autumnal city. And I was like, maybe I should reread it. And he was like, it is always the right time to reread the Dhalgren. I was like, so it is. So yeah, I've read it, and it's not my favorite of his works, but I find it fascinating, and there's passages that just stick with me, and passages that I find kind of a slog, but that's okay. It's certainly worth getting through them.
What is your favorite work of his?
Probably my favorite work of his is a series of fantasy novels and short stories that he wrote after Dhalgren called Return to Navarion, which makes more explicit something that is going on here, which is that it's the 70s. Delaney has been reading a lot of theory, and he more explicitly incorporates it into these fantasy stories that are set in like a dawn of history, Conan the Barbarian style era. It's coming into that tradition, but doing very different things with it and thinking about how civilization is formed from a very, I don't know, playful metatextual way, let's say. I think the 4 books in that series are phenomenal, and I have returned to them more recently, and they are great. But this book has some really special things to it as well.
I was really enchanted in that brief excerpt by this description of this kind of chain thing he has on that has, I guess it's a lens and a mirror and something else optically, a prism. I thought, oh, that's really kind of neat. Wanted to unpack what was going on there. You were mentioning he's kind of gets into the world of theory in the 70s. I wonder, like, because, you think about, like, I don't know, theory of the gaze and, like, the whole idea of, like, visual interpretive lenses, like it's in Lacanian philosophy and stuff like that, right? So I was wondering if I was kind of attracted by that. I thought it was really kind of cool.
Yeah, the different types of distortions that can happen through lenses and the different way that light effects can go on throughout them. Absolutely, he's thinking about these things. There's a kind of device that the scorpions wear that sort of projects a holographic animal head on you, basically. They light up when they go out to rumble, let's say. And so some of the different characters, might have fantastical or normal animals on them. And that kind of like, what is your outside self? Also, the scorpions, like a lot of gangs, let's say, they're very biker gang, other gang coded. They all have nicknames, or almost all of them have nicknames. The kid, obviously, he ends up being the leader of this gang, has this like placeholder name, which is kind of a nickname and kind of a more complicated situation. And the guy that he ends up in this polycule with, Denny, is the only one who just uses his real name. Mm-hmm. And that ends up feeling like a very interesting and intentional thing. But like this question of like who you are, how you represent yourself, how you put yourself out there through the light and the smoke and I guess also the sort of jewelry, the ornamentation. The kid gets known early on because he only wears one shoe for much of it, and this is striking to a lot of people. Yeah,
the chain is cool because it's both like how people see you, like it's a kind of ornamentation, but it's also how you see, like at least in this little excerpt. It's like there's a cool passage, like it said, he ran the chain across his hand. Some of the round ones were transparent. Where they crossed the spaces between his fingers, the light distorted. He lifted the chain to gaze through one of the lenses, but it was opaque. Tilting it, he saw past, dim and inches distant in the circle, his own eye, quivering in the quivering glass. I just thought it was really neat.
It is. And also it has this sense of being a kind of science fictional object, right? It's a confusing technology that you don't get fully explained to you. And
it felt like magical, techie kind of.
Yeah, and it kind of operates that way, as do a few other things. Like there are these weapons that he gets given early on called an orchid, which is like a bunch of blades that you wear around your hand. It's wildly dangerous, but it's also a very threatening looking thing. And the orchid keeps like ending up on his hand. He sort of blacks out maybe, or he doesn't know how it got from being attached to his belt to being ready to use in various moments on it. It's like, well, what exactly is going on here? And hence the name of his poetry collection, Brass Orchids, which is both referring to this weapon that's a signifier for the gang that he's attached to and is very specific to this fallen cities landscape. It's not something the rest of America would have. But also orchid is related to the Greek word for testicle. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I immediately went there, yes.
Yeah, it is very much brass balls, right?
Cool.
And like it's I don't know, it's very, very fun that way.
Yeah, he's such a clever writer.
He's written about it a few times. There's a book that was published not too long ago called On Samuel R. Delaney's Dhalgren, and it collects a lot of reviews from the time. The book was fairly controversial within science fiction circles, within some of them. Some people didn't like it, sometimes because of too much gay sex. But, some people had other things they weren't into it. So it has some of those, as well as some positive reviews. It has some of the essays that he's written about it over the years. It has some reviews that came out when reprints were made, etc. In one of those essays that he wrote around the time after it had been published, he says this: I've always wanted to write books that I wished to read but could not find on any library shelf or bookstore. A kind of book I've always liked is one that's witty, intelligent, formal, colorful, written with life and brio. But there's another that from time to time I hunt out as well. And oddly enough, you will find it described in occasional contemporary introductions to various novels by George Eliot, and Stendhal, the French writer. It is a long book covering exhaustively the social workings of some heretofore unexplored sector of society, orienting it within the greater social context. But it does this almost offhandedly, as if in a passing nod to Arnold's observation that the life of fiction lies in the exactitude with which it can evoke the surfaces of life. And he goes on like that. This is, in a sense, his attempt at a Middlemarch, right? Where he's spending all this time exploring a group of people and how they all end up being connected to them, going into the various connections between the people, and talking about a world that isn't usually talked about, especially in the circles where he's being read. Which is to say that, like, it's an exploration of, like, the burnout of American cities in the 70s and the sort of collapsing inner cores of some of them and the people who ended up there, the artists and the gang members and the other unwanted people in mainstream society who have ended up there and are building other lives that are, that have their difficulties, that see violence sometimes, but also have a lot of freedom and possibility and a lot of, fucking around and sex, And there's something about that which I think is the sort of thing that people have found very appealing about this. The fact that you just see people motivated by and behaving in ways that you don't see or you didn't see in a lot of other literature.
Yeah. But I guess the reason I'm so thoughtful about this is that I've been thinking a lot about fiction, nonfiction, and film. And so, like, you're absolutely right that this is a novel that kind of gives you glimpses into or like tastes of this world that you wouldn't find in literature elsewhere. Would you find it in film of the period, do you think, or no?
That's a good question. Certainly, I will say there is a spiciness to the language around racial identities that was very familiar to me, mostly from films of the 70s and some other, I guess, fiction of the 70s. But, like, again, passages that I'm not comfortable reading aloud. But in terms of this attention to, I don't know. I don't know if there's any films in the 70s. I haven't seen all the 70s films. I don't know, that are as ambitious as this. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, I didn't mean to like sort of derail it into thinking about, I guess it's because I've been thinking so much about fiction and nonfiction. Like, as you know, I really like nonfiction, right? And I was thinking about how funny it was with like Sebald, for example, that like what I'm drawn to is the nonfiction. Same thing with Delany, right? Like, I really love Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. And I started reading a couple of his different novels, but I kept bouncing off them. And I just don't read that much modern fiction, like, by which I mean like after 1950, I guess. And I've been puzzled by this because for earlier periods, I read tons and tons, like I read fiction all the time, right? And I wondered, I finally dawned on me like quite recently that it's for some reason that in my head, film kind of inhabits that space. Like the charge I get from literature of earlier periods, I get from film rather than most times from fiction. Like, it's usually, and so I was thinking about this, like how weird that is. And I think I'm very much swimming against the current because apparently nonfiction doesn't have big readership. Like, so I'm just trying to figure out like, what is going on there in terms of like taste and, I don't know, satisfaction of the imagination.
Yeah. I think one of the things that appeals to me about Delany, as well as some of these other writers he's referencing, is that he will lean into nonfiction in the middle of his fiction. Like, again, there are long discourses about what is poetry What does it mean to be, what is good poetry? He's, the kid, a poet who has never written poetry before, is desperate to ask these more professional poet types that he encounters, what is good poetry? And the most thoughtful of them, who's a much older man, is much more like, oh, that's not even the right question. I couldn't tell you. I don't know. That's not how any of this works. But like, he has really lovely long discourse on that in the middle of this science fiction novel.
I can get behind that.
Yeah. Let me read a bit from towards the end where our narrator is writing about writing in his journal. The falsification of this journal. First off, it doesn't reflect my daily life. Most of what happens hour by hour here is quiet and dull. We sit most of the time, watch the dull sky slipping. Frankly, that is too stupid to write about. When something really involving, violent, or important happens, it occupies too much of my time, my physical energy, and my thought for me to be able to write about. I can think of 4 things that have happened in the nest, in the scorpion's home, I would like to have described when they occurred, but they so completed themselves in the happening that even to refer to them seems superfluous. What is down, then, is a chronicle of incidents with a potential for wholeness they did not have when they occurred. A false picture, again, because they show neither the general spread of our lives' fabric nor the most significant pattern points, to show the one is too boring and the other too difficult, etc., etc. And it's like, it's engaging in criticism and in lines of criticism. It's directly in the book. Like, that is a major theme throughout the book, is people interrogating what it means to do the things that they're doing, to make the art that they're making, to have the sex that they're having, to do all those things. And so there's sort of a pleasant non-fiction-y aspect to all of this. I mean, it was an interesting book to read after having read Peter Hujar's Day last time, because they're both coming out of sort of New York in the 70s, when it was at its low point, so to speak, in terms of, I don't know, standard metrics of how well the city is doing, but had a vibrant art scene in it, as well as vibrant other cultural scenes. And, they obviously take wildly different approaches to it, but there is a desire to grasp at what is going on here. What's the real of this situation?
Yeah. You know what I was reminded of, too, when you were reading that passage, especially, is Edmund White's Forgetting Elena.
Yeah.
Which we had, where, again, very different kind of theme, different kind of focus, different mode of writing, and also from the 70s, and also reflecting this kind of tendency to theorize the world while observing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that I like about the Delany that I like the most, is that he's just, I don't know, shameless about it. Why would you be shameful about it? And that's also true in Middlemarch, right? Mm-hmm. One of the delightful things about Middlemarch is the narrator who is willing to stop for a moment and just talk about what's going on. Isn't doing it as metatextually as Delany does, I suppose, but nevertheless is just giving beautiful little essays in the middle of this about what's happening. I guess that's also true of several of the other books that we've circled around again and again.
Well, yeah, but I think books that are about consciousness. If we ever read Henry James together, I bet you there'll be some of that same kind of stuff going on, that sort of circling around and introspecting, right?
Yeah.
Even in the midst of description.
But that's sort of one of the things that novels can do that film has a harder time, or it does differently, is that it's just got language. Like, obviously, language is more forefront in a novel than it is in a film, and that's fine. Film has other things that it does really well, but I like the language that Delany puts out, that he works and overworks sometimes, and it's even when I say he overworks it, that's not necessarily a problem. I enjoy that he's so attentive to it.
Yeah, he's excellent.
Well, 2 challenging books in different ways, and revisiting 2 authors who we've looked at before. Maybe I will do another Delany book someday. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's more Sebald to do as well, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely.
But in the meantime, is there anything coming up that you're excited about?
Oh, gosh. I'm really excited that it's almost spring, I think.
Yes.
I'm tired of winter. I don't want any more winter. So there's that. And otherwise, No, I'm really hoping that I'm going to be able to use the spring and summer to make some progress on writing projects. Like we talked many times in the past about maybe, turning some of the conversations we've had into written form. And I haven't done that, but I've been thinking about that a lot. So maybe I'll be able to experiment with that a little bit in the coming months.
Yeah, I've had a thought or two about that sort of thing, and I've been letting them percolate.
Oh, good.
But I'm not sure that listeners, if you have any ideas what sort of the Spouter-Inn book adjacent thing you'd be interested in, write in and tell us what you want. And maybe that'll help us focus things. I am excited about spring as well. It's finally, it's going to snow again. I know it will, but it's much nicer now than it was.
Full spring.
Exactly. I am also doing something that I haven't done for 9 years of podcasting as of a few days ago, which is that I'm going to be taking a little bit of a sabbatical for the next few months.
You deserve it.
Thank you. I feel like I need it. So I will be stepping away from the mic for just a bit, but I suspect that there will be an episode coming out with a guest sitting in my seat, so to speak. And it will probably be somebody who you've heard before as a friend of the podcast, but we'll leave some of those details to be a bit of a surprise. But hopefully that will be very delightful and entertaining for everybody. And then you won't be too upset when I come back in the summer. Nobody
can fill your shoes, but they can try them on.
Exactly. But in the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with us listeners, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We'd love to hear from you. This show is made possible by people like you supporting us on Patreon, and patrons get to hang out with us in a friendly Discord. You can find out more at patreon.com/megaphonic. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/91. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.